here. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here, Joe Bast. Yay, Joe Bast, the CEO of the Heartland Institute is here. Diane Bast is here. What's your title anymore? Short timer, that's your title. And thank you, Jim Johnston, a member of the board of directors, is also here as well. I want to thank everyone watching online and here tonight on a nice cold night. Nice to come inside and get warm up with some policy discussions, which is what we bring you here. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. And Happy New Year. When does the statute of limitations on Happy New Year run out? Is it the end of January? Double digits? I'm good. I'm going to do it until Groundhog Day. It's official. That's when you do it. So thank you all for being here. I want to tell you a little bit about Heartland, then I'm going to introduce our two speakers. The Heartland Institute was founded in 1984 in Chicago by a group of individuals led by our founder, David Padden, who met regularly around a table to discuss the value of free markets and the importance of advancing and protecting individual liberty, and not just amongst the policy wonks in Washington, D.C., and with members of Congress, although that is important, but it's just as important, if not more so, to have those discussions here in the heartland of America, and specifically for elected officials at all levels, who, for instance, might think it's a good time to shrink the size and the power of government and to start privatizing services. And that's the topic of tonight's talk by our two guests, Len Gilroy and Austell Stewart of the Reason Foundation. They authored Chapter 5 of the new 4th edition of the Patriot's Toolbox, the chapter on privatization. This is the book right here. And you can get that at heartland.org. This is actually part of a series of discussions we're going to have about this book, The Patriot's Toolbox, the 4th edition. Back in November, we had Dan Pilla. He was here. Some of you here saw him. He gave a discussion on federal tax policy that was as informative as it was entertaining. He wrote the chapter on federal tax policy. Tonight is about privatization, Chapter 5 of the Patriot's Toolbox. Next month, we're having Heartland Senior Fellow, or Research Fellow, I should say, Isaac Orr. He's going to be talking about energy, the chapter on energy and the environment. And then in March, we're going to have Vicki Alger in here to talk about the chapter on education policy. So I hope you will come to as many of these as possible. Bring your copy of the book that you have, and if you don't have one, you can get one tonight, and have all the authors of the chapters sign your book for you. And if you like what you see and hear tonight, hard to say, whether here in person or watching this thing online, I encourage you to look around at heartland.org. You can find a lot of research on free markets and libertarian policy there. You can check out our blog, The Freedom Pub, where we are updating that every day with lots of great discussions on the news of the day. You can also check out our daily podcast on iTunes. We finished the year of 2017 with 2.4 million downloads of that podcast last year, and we're going to continue to grow even more in 2018. So get on your mobile device, go to iTunes, look up Heartland Daily Podcast, and become one of the many listeners of that podcast in the year ahead. And you can also check out our YouTube page, where this video is going to be shown with all the events we have here on our YouTube page. We also are we're really ramping up our video production at Heartland this year. We've hired some staff and bought some equipment. We have a new TV studio. Naming rights to that studio are still available, so you can call Heartland and get that name for you, but it's in the other side of this building. We're going to be on TV more often, but even more than that, we're doing a lot of policy videos that you can find on our YouTube page as well. One of them is called Flashes of Freedom, which is a really nifty way for like 2 or 3 minutes to get some great policy information to you. We have 2 Minutes with Tim Hulskamp, our new president of the Heartland Institute, where he's talking about the issues of the day. And so I think you're going to find a lot of great new content on our YouTube page and also elsewhere on our properties where you'll be able to find it. And again, if you like what you see here tonight and you believe in liberty and you believe in advancing free markets and you believe in fighting the left and government control over your life, please consider joining the Heartland Institute. Become a donor. Become a volunteer. Just get into the fight, because we are winning this fight more and more every day, and it's a fantastic psychic thing to be a part of that. And with that, I would now like to bring up our two speakers tonight, both from the Reason Foundation. Len Gilroy is the Director of Government Reform at Reason, where he primarily researches privatization. He's the editor of Reason's Privatization and Government Reform and Pension Reform newsletters and is co-editor of Reason's annual privatization report. Austell Stewart is a policy analyst at Reason who researches privatization, transportation, and government reform. We simply could not have picked two people, along with their colleague, Adrian Moore, VP of Policy at the Reason Foundation. We could not have picked three better gentlemen to write the chapter on privatization for the Patriots Toolbox, and I am looking forward to hearing a lot more about the topic. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Len Gilroy and Austell Stewart.
Thank you, everyone. First of all, I'm Len. This is Austell. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's really an honor to have all of you come and spend your evening listening and learning about, hopefully learning, if we do our job properly tonight, about a topic that's near and dear to us, near and dear to Reason Foundation, I think near and dear to a lot of people in the sort of center-right movement generally, which is privatization. And for Reason Foundation, just by way of background, Reason, we're nearing our 50th anniversary. We're going to be hitting that here, and you'll be... Yes, and I'm not sure if anyone back there, if there's any volume. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. For Reason Foundation, it's been, privatization has been sort of a foundational issue for us. As a think tank, in a lot of ways, we really carved out a lot of ground back in the late 70s and early 80s on this issue that I think have, kind of borne through to today. We've seen ideas that predecessors of ours at Reason Foundation that came up with a long time ago are now being implemented out there. We'll talk about some of that tonight. But I think what we want to leave you with tonight is hopefully some more perspective on privatization. It's one of those issues that a lot of people talk about. Very few people actually know much about. There's a lot of myths out there about what privatization is and how it works. And on both sides, I would say, on folks who believe in privatization, I would say some of that may be based on intuition and could be refined by more knowledge of how things work and how things should work. On the other side, I think there are folks who tend to believe a lot of myths about how privatization work or don't work, that are either false or just based on antiquated practices, or we've learned and moved beyond that. So I think no matter which way you're coming from, I think there's a lot of nuance in this space. So hopefully we'll touch on some of that tonight, and then we'd love to get your feedback and get your questions. So let's just dive right in. And by the way, I'm Len Gilroy. I've been at Reason for this is my 17th year, I think, at Reason Foundation. It's been a long time. So I've worked on privatization. I work on pension reform, other tax and fiscal issues. I, for about 10 years, was the only editor of the privatization report. And then Austell, we hired a few years ago, and Austell is taking some of the editorial responsibilities from me, and this year actually led the show. So when you read the 2017, the most recent version of the annual privatization report, that's you can credit Austell for that. So anyway, let's dive in. Anything to add before we
credit or don't credit? No.
All right, so let's start with the first question. What is privatization? People have a lot of different perceptions of what privatization is, so let's just simplify this and let's get to a good grounding level. All privatization is generally in the U.S. context, an arrangement between the government, some government entity, and some private sector entity to do something. That could be deliver a service, could be deliver an asset, could be to upgrade an asset, it could be a lot of different things, but fundamentally it's just a partnership between the sectors. Sorry, all right. To that point, there are a lot of different names for privatization, a lot of different terms that you might see out there that generally mean some variation on the same theme. Public-private partnerships is one that we tend to see used in this context. We see PPPs, that would be a shorthand term for that. Sometimes I would say that the PPP term is sort of applying what we would think about, in the privatization world. Sometimes that term is used for other things. So, a lot of terminology, can be confusing here a little bit. But generally, we, again, mean some kind of partnership between the government and a private entity. But contracting out is another term for this. Contracting out a service or activity. Outsourcing, common term. Competitive sourcing would be another term that primarily at the federal government. Competitive tendering would be the term, same term overseas in the UK. These are all variations on the same thing. It's all about some sort of partnership. This could be very simple things. It could be who is trimming the trees in the city park. Very simple outsourcing types of activities. You could be talking about something simple like that, all the way up to who is financing and building and operating your multi-billion dollar infrastructure systems out there, and literally everything in between. We're often asked, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but what can you privatize or what can't you privatize? And the short answer is there are very few things that haven't been successfully privatized somewhere. So it's really a matter of looking out there, looking at a range of experience and finding things that work in that particular asset category. Use different levels of things here too. I mean, when one type of privatization, a very simple low-level term, might involve things like volunteer activity. We saw a lot of this after the recession, particularly in law enforcement agencies, where they were short-staffed. They would bring in either retirees or citizens, and they would sort of deputize them to do some of the light-duty type of work that doesn't involve the sworn officers. Corporate sponsorships, naming rights of stadia, that sort of thing. That might be one kind of low-level privatization. You dial it up, you start getting into service-level contracting. That would be things like contracting out for filling potholes, trimming trees in parks, doing landscaping, IT systems, all sorts of things. And then you can dial it up further into the category of infrastructure, which is you've seen some of these sorts of things around here. You'll probably be seeing more of privately financed infrastructure. This is literally saying we're going to bring in the private sector to do everything from financing, building, operating, designing these sorts of assets. And we're talking about toll roads, we're talking about airports, parking assets. There's all sorts of things out there. Transit, there's even transit P3s. So there's a lot of different things out there that in the infrastructure P3 bucket. The bottom line is this, though. Privatization is a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, it's a tool. That's all it is. It's a tool. It can be used well. It can be used poorly. We've seen lots of examples of both. What is really important here is that to do it well, you have to do it well. You have to have best practices. You have to learn the lessons from folks who've been there and done that. You have to look at the places that have failed and learn from those and iterate and improve upon it. But when you do that, you can usually generate very good results. Sorry, we're getting a little sticky here. The reason that privatization tends to work, fundamentally, is that what we're talking about is introducing competition into what tends to be a monopolistic area of activity, meaning public sector service delivery. The traditional model would be public sector employees deliver those public services, but by bringing competition into the mix, you are then doing what competition does in the marketplace. You're basically competing to drive down costs and improve services and improve assets and the things that the consumer is looking for. In this case, taxpayers. So, and then the next question becomes, okay, well, why would we do this? Why privatize? What is the value here? The first thing that people tend to land on, and maybe the attractor, the lure of privatization, tends to be cost savings. That's oftentimes what policymakers are going for. And that can come from a lot of different things. It could come from the private sector entities paying competitive wages, but maybe the benefit package looks different. It could be more efficiency in staffing. A lot of different things, technology, bringing that to bear in a situation. There are a lot of ways that the private sector can be more efficient and drive down costs, but this is usually the first reason that people look at it. Although I would argue that it is probably not the best reason to look at it. That may sound to some like heresy, but what I would say is, cost savings are important. But that may not be the reason that you're doing this. There may be other reasons why you would go to the market to deliver a service. One, I think this is actually more important than cost savings. Risk management. To me, this is the most important part of privatization, no matter what kind you're talking about, is the ability to better manage risk. Government entities take on all kinds of risk every day on behalf of taxpayers that taxpayers have no idea that they're taking. And frankly, sometimes the governments don't know that they're really taking those risks either because they haven't really internalized them or view them as risks. I'll give you a quick example. Being able to mitigate the risk of construction cost overruns, for instance. In a contract, before we entered the modern era of lots of innovation and contracting, you might have contracts that didn't hold a contractor accountable for delivering an asset, for instance, delivering a highway or something on time, on a fixed delivery date. Well, we see, over the last couple of decades, we've seen innovation in contracting that created contexts in which you just build that into the contract and say, here's what we're going to do. We want this road built, but we also want it built by this date. And if it's not built by this date, we're going to put provisions in that contract. One I saw in Texas was $10,000 a day that highway was not open. The contractor was on the hook for $10,000 a day that road wasn't open. They got that road built early, and it was open 30 days early because of incentives like that. In a different kind of contract, that might not have happened. That may have been a contract that could have let that cost overrun happen, but being innovative in the way the contract was designed allowed them to mitigate the risk of cost overruns. And you see that in a lot of different ways. And when there are risks that need to be managed, you can build that into the contract and basically manage it via contract. Beyond risk management, it's also quality. It's not just about cost savings, risk, it's also about quality and using the privatization tool to drive better quality. Effectively, in a contract, you can build in things like, here's the benchmark of where the public sector was operating this. Quality. It's not just about okay, I am echoing here. Anyway, for quality, you could build in the contract. We expect to see incremental improvements upon the public sector baseline each year in the contract. We want to build that into the contract, and we will provide incentives to hit those targets. Or we want you to hit the baseline, but we'll give you incentives if you exceed it. You can do a lot of different things there to drive quality in the context of a performance-based contract, and we're going to talk about that more. Sometimes you just need different types of expertise. Governments maybe it wouldn't be prudent to have certain types of employees on staff all the time, 24/7, all year. Sometimes you might have fluctuating demand. Snow plowing, for instance, would be a great example of something like this, where you got a lot of demand in the winter, nothing in the summer. You don't need to have full-time staff and equipment necessarily sitting around to deal with that issue. So being able to contract for, or maybe it's an IT or a technical issue where really you need to go to the market because that's where the brain power is on that particular issue. A lot of different ways you can tap that expertise, but that's another value add here. And then just a couple more to wrap up. Sorry, okay. Innovation, I think this is one of the interesting applications of privatization is to basically set the private sector off with the mission and the task of innovating and saying, go do something different, go do better. Here's what we want as an outcome, you go figure out how to do it and do it better. Do it better, faster, and cheaper. That's routinely a way that privatization is used. Timeliness, again, this is maybe a similar theme as to the construction cost issue, but basically you can build in, if timing is an issue, you can contract for that. And then, again, being able to meet peak demand, that would be a situation like the snow plowing or something like that, where you're just going to have fluctuations and you need flexibility. And going to the market and tapping that service by contract would give you the flexibility and the ability to not have to adjust your workforce up or down to meet those demands. You can just do it through contract. So.
And excuse me. And when entering to privatization, there are often a few goals that municipalities and other entities have, other government entities. With cost savings, as we mentioned, typically 10 to 25% savings is not abnormal. It's pretty normal, depending on what area as well. Quality and service improvements, oftentimes, if you have a wastewater system or something that needs a lot of upgrades, the city or the municipality will not have the resources to do that themselves, and they can bring the private sector in and do that, and also hold them accountable for doing it and making sure that they don't they don't have the deferred maintenance costs in the future. Oh, and innovation, as Lynn kind of mentioned earlier, there are opportunities. The private sector has done things in these areas that the public sector hasn't been able to take advantage of. And there's also rules with government procurement and other things that allow for less flexibility in getting things done than the private sector can take advantage of. And as Lynn touched on, risk management is huge. Those big P3 agreements involving infrastructure, you can almost see them as a giant risk management transfer agreement. And it's just a question of what do you want transferred. We've mentioned cost deferments, delivery time, things like that. And, it can be put into the contract. Yeah. Accelerated delivery, very closely related. Typically, they can get it done quicker. When I lived in Birmingham, we had a section of the interstate collapse. They had private contractors come build it, and I think they finished, 2 months ahead of schedule, and they got a very big bonus payment for that, actually. And private capital. I go to conferences, and people with large companies will say, hey, we have all this private capital just kind of sitting on the sidelines, waiting for opportunities to come in. Well, P3s present a big opportunity for that, and you're starting to see that, and not just companies, like pension systems and other things. The Chicago Skyway is partially owned by, or that's the Indiana one.
Indiana Toll Road.
Yeah,
yes.
it's partially owned by California's retirement system, CalPERS.
A consortium of actually over a dozen public pension funds are investors in the Indiana Toll Road. The analogous situation here would be the Chicago Skyway. And to that last point, I think it's important to just put a point on this. There are literally hundreds of billions of dollars in global capital sitting in global infrastructure investment funds looking for places to invest, looking for roads, bridges, water systems, wastewater, you kind of name it, that's what they're looking for. And so that money is going to go to the places that are embracing this, right? And today in this country, now about 36 or so states have some kind of law, including Illinois, that allows for private financing of infrastructure assets. And so the states that are creating the most effective structures to attract that capital, that's where it's going to go. The people who put in the rules that are transparent, that are trusted processes, that's where the market is going to look and go, that's where I want to do business. I would like to go and invest hundreds of billions of dollars in these sorts of places. So it's not a small point, that private capital bit, because if you kind of look out there in any type of infrastructure category, asset category in this country, there are the needs, the amount of infrastructure investment needs are overwhelming, and the government, traditional tax dollars are not there to do it. So we either can choose to watch infrastructure of different kinds degrade and collapse, or, tap private dollars, right? And that's a choice that a lot of places are looking at trying to make. So there we go.
And one last point, it's not just, hard infrastructure as well. Social impact bonds, that's basically going to a group of people with money and saying, hey, let's end homelessness. And they'll try to get people together that, they think they can do that, and they buy into it. And if they're not successful, they lose the money. But if they are, then they will have, achieved the goal of reducing homelessness while also making a little money off of it.
Okay, all right.
And in terms of what can be privatized, just about, as Lynn said, pretty much everything has been tried. Public work, you can just go ahead and just start clicking. Street maintenance planning, EMS dispatches, libraries, legal, accounting, engineering services, vehicle fleet maintenance and operations, IT, that's very big in local governments and state governments as well, parks. Pretty much everything has been tried. There was actually a municipality in California, they ended up not doing it, but they were even looking to privatize all their public works, including police and fire. Didn't happen, but it could happen. And just to show you, you have a spectrum. Some of it's just more outsourcing of a service, the ones you see more on top, whereas at the bottom, it's more dealing with assets.
Sorry.
And and now we'll jump into the principles first. What can, identifying what can be privatized where you are, and also how. There are 4 different ways. Contracting out's basically just contracting out for a service, anything from garbage pickup, very basic stuff usually. Concession leases usually are, deals with that involving assets, oftentimes 30, sometimes even close to 100 years, where the private entity basically manages the asset, and they may do operations and maintenance and stuff. It depends on how it's constructed, but for a period of time, they operate it. Oftentimes with toll roads, they'll collect the revenue and share it back with the government entity. And also at the end of the lease, the municipality can buy it back, or the state can either buy it back or not. And also, there's usually a clause that says the private entity has to turn back the asset in the same or better condition than they started with. And and vouchers, most common in schools, obviously, where there's school choice. Fortunately, we don't have that in my home state of Alabama still. But basically, the citizens, that are eligible for a service are given a voucher or a credit to buy that. And divestiture, selling off assets or getting rid of services as well. You see that where you have small towns within counties. Oftentimes, there'll be like a county running the library or something, and they decide, well, we're closing this branch in this area, and so that that small town will have to do their own, or or you have to rely on neighbors or something. For some reason. But
All right.
and another way of thinking about what to look at to be privatized, the Yellow Pages test. It's a term coined by the former mayor of Indianapolis. And basically what it boils down to is if there's a service that government wants to provide, and they can look in the Yellow Pages and find a private entity that's willing to provide that service, then the government should pay the private entity to do it. And you see that for everything, water, dealing with engineering, water, legal services, a lot of the professional services, and a lot of infrastructure work as well. A lot of that stuff is already handled by private sector firms, often very close by. And and what this does is you get oh wow, you've already moved. We're on principle 2 now. All right.
We're just having slide transition.
But yeah, business case evaluation. It's really important to. We're going back now. But yeah, but basically when the government continues to provide these services that other entities could provide, they're taking revenues away from the private sector. Plus, there's no tax being generated from it. They're consuming taxes to do it. So, in some ways, it can be a win-win. And also, if the entity does a bad job, you can contract out with another one too.
All right. Well, let's go on to another principle here. If I can get past this, let's talk about business case evaluation for a minute. Here, I'm going to hand this to you to play with this for a minute.
All right.
So, I mentioned early on in this conversation about decision making and shifting from basically making privatization decisions on intuition, if you will, just on a belief that privatization will work, or a belief, just an intuitive belief that the private sector is superior. I don't think that is the way to go about making these decisions. I think what you really need to do is build a business case. Do the same thing the private sector does when they start thinking about big transitions. It's pretty common to do a business case analysis and say, what's the rationale for doing this? And let's think through the rationale. Let's think through, if we were to do this, how would we build this? For instance, how would we build if we were going to do a contract for, providing an intervention to reduce recidivism? What metrics would we use? What would we want to apply? How would we evaluate the success? What would we build performance around? Let's think about that up front. How would we, if we do this, deal with maybe the current employees in the public sector that are providing this service? How would we navigate that transition? All those sorts of things need to be thought about up front before you make this decision, because a lot of times they aren't thought through very well. And when you see privatization fail, oftentimes it's because of not properly thinking through it, not properly thinking through how you're going to manage this process, and then things inevitably you have hiccups along the way, and then if you haven't really thought through that, you might not be well prepared for that and could have some issues. And so doing a business case up front is a very important, I believe, aspect of doing privatization well. This is something that I think the best story behind this, to make it real for you, would be early on in Jeb Bush's administration in Florida, two-term governor of Florida. One of the things that he ran on was reducing the size and scope of state government. in Florida. And one of the first things they rolled out in his administration in the first term was a massive, $1 billion+ IT, information technology overhaul contract. And IT is one of the trickiest things to start with. So if you're a new governor coming in, number one, don't start with IT privatization. Get your sea legs under you, if you will. But they picked a tricky one, and it had problems. As you could imagine, doing an IT computer sort of overhaul in a state government context can create turf issues and different agencies. You had a bunch of different agencies that were like, well, we like this idea, but we're special and we need this customized thing that you vendors need to build into this IT apparatus for us because we're special. And each agency is basically saying the same thing. So what happens? Predictably, cost overruns, lots of problems, and then, the media going, great, good way to start off this privatization push, Governor. How did this go? And essentially, there was one point where Governor Bush basically said something to the effect of, guys, you're right. We didn't do the very good job of doing this, and we're going to do better at this. We're going to actually make better decisions. And to that end, he created, our Reason Foundation was part of this. He created a center of excellence to basically do business case analysis for state agencies. Now, in the recession, they ended up cutting that agency in the many budget cuts that they had to do in Florida. So this thing existed for a short term and then was gone. But it was Jeb Bush's response to failed privatizations was, let's put into place something that can do business case analysis to make sure that we're making the right decisions on behalf of the taxpayers, and we can stand up here and justify it, 24/7 because we've done our thinking up front. Let's go to the next one. And then to that end, the other piece of that is you need somebody to do those business case analyses, and certainly some agencies are good enough at doing procurement and doing contracting well that they might be able to do it, but oftentimes we find that experience around the world suggests that creating a center of excellence to basically do privatization and these sort of public-private partnerships well, that's something that we've seen a lot of, particularly in the Australian and Canadian provinces who've done this sort of thing a lot. UK, in Europe, a lot of entities basically exist to do either business case analyses to make sure you're doing the upfront planning, and then also doing value for money analyses to make sure that the numbers are there and the numbers add up and the numbers justify the decision. So there's lots of different ways to structure that, but we're starting to see in the U.S. Different types of examples of this sort of thing. I mentioned the Council on Efficient Government in Florida. That's what Jeb created to do his center of excellence, but you've got something in Texas right now called the Council on Competitive Government, and that's an entity who can do these sorts of enterprise-wide, looking across state government, and they will basically take the tricky multi-agency type procurements and help navigate those waters. You also have something in Utah called used to be called the Privatization Policy Board. They changed it now to be the Free Market Protection and Privatization Board, but that is an entity that also they don't maybe go to that business case level yet, but they do analyses of privatization, of proposed privatizations before anything happens, and they will also do inventories of every agency. What things do you have and what do you do that could be privatized? We'll actually talk a little bit about that as well coming up. So, actually, why don't you want to talk about that one?
Well, yeah, in DC, they just started their own P3 office, being they're not really a state, but they too are, they're in a weird situation because they're not a state, B, they're in between Virginia and Maryland, so a lot of their projects, require input from multiple government entities, and they're with, everything from the rail system to, roads projects, hot lane projects, toll lanes, and stuff like that. They've thought, perhaps we should have our own little internal thing to manage this, and it's only been they've done a few successful contractings through it. I think some IT stuff and a few other things. And Lynn's point about assessing commercial or inherently governmental activities, a lot of people don't know this. The federal government does it as well, and even if you look at when Obama left office, the last Department of Education inventory of all their activities done by Obama's appointed Department of Education secretary, even he thought I think was it Arnie Duncan at the end? I can't remember. But they thought that over 50% of their positions could be performed by the private sector. And this is the head of the agency saying that, not a Republican in Congress or someone. So if they're saying it, perhaps.
Well, and that's the point. Well, just to tease it, we're going to come to it later, but this is not a partisan issue. People on the right and left, countries, if you will, right and left even, have robustly used privatization. So we'll come back to that point in a little bit. Do you want to?
Oh, yes. And principle 4, cost, as Lynn said, that's a lot of what people are looking for when they enter in these agreements, but it's not necessarily the best thing. Value could, there are a lot of moving parts to what objectives can be assessed on, and value, it's a little harder to hit, but it's often a better way to go about things. Part of that is if you have people, if you have local businesses that might be able to do some of these things, treat them like anyone else. There's expertise all over the country and even outside of the country in a lot of these things, and tapping into that, can be very helpful. And it may not necessarily be that the local entities have the best grasp of this, you should have a clear idea of what outcomes you want, but make sure the outcomes, they're things to shoot for, but you shouldn't be prescriptive in how they should be done. Just saying like you should clean this once a week or something like that. Well, shouldn't be maintaining a clean whatever be better, and maybe you don't have to do it as much. And perhaps the most difficult part of this is taking your in-house stuff and looking at the private sector and seeing how they do it, and actually, making it so you can have an apples-to-apples comparison. Because, government accounting it's a lot different from private sector accounting, but it can be very helpful in really making a strong assessment on what it really is the best. If, the private sector may be more expensive, but if the level of service goes up significantly, then that should be taken into account too. And then performance-based contracting, which we'll talk about a little more in just a sec, that ensures that you have the private sector's incentives align with your own incentives. Put provisions in there that say, if you don't get this done, then we're going to ding you, we're going to hurt you, we're not going to pay you as much, we'll assess a penalty. Or in some cases, if you do it and do it quickly and do it well, then we may even pay you more, because at that point we'll have already gotten more than we've put into it from our standpoint. So yeah, and to encourage you, we'll throw you back some more too. And I think that's it. Yes, transparency across the board, every step of the process, and that prevents the opportunities that some people would come in and try to hijack the process themselves for their own benefit. Yeah. Yes, I'm in. I keep forgetting I'm in. It's like there's no shortage of that.
Jim actually asked us about this. We recorded a podcast with Jim a little bit earlier and was asking us about this cronyism piece. And, this is an important element of it, because if you're our contention here is, low bid may be appropriate in some situations, may not be what you want in others. Sometimes if I'm hungry, maybe McDonald's is okay, but maybe I'd rather have like a nice dinner out downtown, right? I have a different preference there, right? Best value is one of the tricky parts for people to understand about best value is, well, if it's not just based on low bid criteria, and it's a subjective thing that there's a number and we can say this number is greater than that, then how do you make a decision? And those are fair points. And then also, how do you make a decision and avoid the sort of cronyism issue when you have other factors sort of at play? And the transparency angle is the answer to that. To some extent, cronyism is difficult. To a certain extent, cronyism will always be there, so you have to build in, or the potential for that, I should say, is always there. So you have to build in the mechanisms to try to crowd that out or block that out. So transparency, having very clear criteria about how you're making decisions. So, how are you going to weight? Maybe price is a part of it, but you have other, service quality and other things. How are you going to weight those in some sort of objective scoring criteria would be a way to sort of address that. To make sure that you can look at the bids received and look at the scores afterwards and figure out how a decision was made. And so basically, like, any tool and like any public policy, transparency is a good disinfectant. And that's how you ensure accountability. So that's, that would be sort of a response to that. And I mean, it's a legitimate concern, but it's one that, you have to design good processes. And again, as I said earlier, privatization is a tool. It can be done well. It can be done poorly. If you want to do it well, you have to have, transparency right from the beginning. All right, let's have the next slide.
And yes, performance-based contracting, as we mentioned, it really aligns the incentives of the private sectors well with, the public sector. And part of that is just really getting your objectives in a way that allows the private sector to really, maximize its ability to deliver. And, there's an example in the book we give. There was, I think it was a military, some military establishment, and basically they had to wax their floors every week. And that was the rule. And then someone said, well, wait a minute, what if we don't wax them every week and we just say it needs to have a certain standard of cleanliness or shininess or whatever? And they ended up doing that, and it ended up working better for them, and they ended up saving money by not having to wax their floor every week. And so that's, it can work the same way in many other things. Instead of saying you have to pick up, or you have to do this every week, just have some standard of cleanliness, or if it's like tree trimming or something, the length of certain branches or whatever, or mowing, the length of the grass, things like that, and that could be helpful.
This is a classic, just before we get there, it's sort of a classic example of what we think of as like outputs and outcomes, that sort of thing. Another example of this that I saw in a contract in a municipal context was grass at a park, right? Or actually, sorry, it was a lawn around like the city hall. And sort of moving from a contracting approach that said you have to mow the grass once a week or once every 2 weeks or something like that, to somebody asked the question, okay, but how do we know, like, why that? What about this? What if we say the grass can be no longer than 3 inches high, or, whatever the number is? What about that? Let's try that. How would that change things? And what they found out was that they were cutting the grass too much. Like if you required it every 2 weeks, you were sort of overkill. You didn't need that much. And so setting the standard to be a little different and to be something where you're basically saying the outcome I want is this. I don't care how you get there. I don't care if you mow the grass every day. That's on you. But for me to measure this contract, it's got to be the grass. I'm going to go with a ruler, and I'm going to stick it in the ground, and I'm going to see, is it 3 inches or more? And then I will score you accordingly. And that kind of thinking is really important here, because that can make or break how this stuff works. Just specifying those kinds of details is literally what will make success or failure sometimes in these sorts of arrangements. But go ahead.
And then, as kind of touched upon, reward for success and then penalize for failure. If they don't do something, or they fail to live up to their contractual obligations, make sure to find them. And you got to have, and we'll get into monitoring, and that gives a that gives a job to the government that they've been, sometimes they do pretty well and sometimes they don't, but there's money sitting on the table by not doing it well, so they should. And we'll get more into that in a sec. And in fact, here we are, effective monitoring and oversight. It's not an inexpensive process, but over time it pretty much pays for itself by, as I mentioned, identifying opportunities to find contractors when they don't meet their expectations, incorrect payments, things like that. You gotta, we're all human, we all make mistakes. Just because you get overcharged by a contractor doesn't mean there's some malicious intent, but you still have to have eyes to make sure that doesn't happen, because it can.
Yeah, this is the trust but verify piece of all of this.
And some are really easy. Like, if you don't get your garbage picked up, you call and you get a complaint, and you can base the contract on, amount of complaints, or, failure to pick up a certain amount of times or something like that. Other things are harder to measure, a little harder to grasp. You might need, might require some outside help to get a firmer grasp on how you do things. But I'd say for most things that can be outsourced or privatized, there are things there that can be measured to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, this is I would say, aside from getting the performance and the contract right, this is the other key piece of getting this all correct. A contract is only as good as the enforcement of the contract terms, right? And so if you sign a contract and then you don't do this, then you've just, hopefully things will work out well, but you've just given away the keys to the store. So government's job, this is the thing I think people need to understand about privatization, is that government doesn't end its role if they sign a contract. That's not how privatization works. It's more of like a marriage, usually, in these kinds of situations where there's a contract. There are two parties and it's a marriage. And so each party has a role there and a responsibility. And in this case, government's responsibility in this type of situation shifts from being the provider an overseer to just being the overseer. And that's a different role, and they have to, get used to it, and they have to basically build the skill at doing this to get privatization done well. And that's why these things all kind of weave together, right? So I would throw that in with the Center of Excellence and, those other best practices that we already talked about to say that's how you get these things together is, you not only do you have to build the contract, right, but you have to have expertise in how to maintain it and how to hold contractors' feet to the fire to get them to deliver. So.
And the transition period is very critical here because when you have employees going from in-house state government work to private sector, how they handle that can be instrumental in how it's gonna how things are gonna happen afterwards. So like with contractors rewarding them for good performance, if they're employees in that transition process that are exemplary and and very helpful and look willing to take charge, then reward them too. And then bundling services. Contract cities, they're mostly in Georgia and California, the ones that do exist. Basically, these are cities that have close to 100% of all their public works and services contracted out. But I think Sandy Springs started in 2005. Since then, they've done a couple of things in-house, but mostly they've adhered to it, and there are a bunch of other cities around there as well. In Illinois, you have the Smart Cities Initiative. Chicago started that when, converting to LED lighting on the highways. Well, the state, they, did a bid for the entire state, and so now smaller, towns and cities that might not be able to get an agreement themselves, or it would be very costly to have, a private entity just do them. By open up the entire state, then there are greater opportunities for the private sector in terms of economies of scale that build on and have a greater reach there. Oh, and another, I'm sorry, I missed the Pennsylvania one. Pennsylvania had hundreds and hundreds of bridges that were in terrible, terrible condition, most of them on state and county roads, and the state basically contracted out with a private entity to go around and fix those, and so far it's been going very well. And then Georgia, this is more I'd say whereas these two are more horizontal, this is more vertical, the Georgia facilities thing. They started out doing, juvenile hall operations, basically just facilities operations, and they did such a good job, they went ahead and expanded it to all of their secure facilities, basically. So again, it's an economies of scale thing. The state ended up saving more by doing more of them, whereas the private entity made more by doing more on their part.
Yeah, and the underlying point there is that before that, they were, I believe that, like in that Georgia example, they had, each individual facility had like a contract with somebody that would come in to do the facilities maintenance at each facility. And so bundling that up into one big master contract was sort of one big advance because you get effectively, they locked it in for a longer term, got more budget predictability, and a better deal, effectively, in savings. And after piloting that for a while, they said, "Hey, this worked well. Let's expand this out to a bunch of other facilities." And so, I guess the larger point is, as Austin mentioned, sometimes doing some type of privatization contract for one entity or for one service might not just make that much sense. But if you bundle it with other things, you might have something there. And so it really requires thinking holistically about what you're trying to do, and think, really about maybe not only the service that you're talking about, but other things that thread to it. There are lots of different ways to package up these sorts of arrangements. So being creative and not being stuck in your own silo of how you think governments should be operating is really important here for the public sector administrators doing this.
Yeah, I tried to rewind here, but we're on set now.
Yes.
And also preparing a real property inventory. Governments, they're tasked with doing a ton of things. They end up owning a lot of buildings and other assets based on that. Oftentimes, they don't even know what they own, though. Phoenix, Arizona is a recent example. They had, I think, thousands of properties that they own that there's just nothing being done to them. Some were in, relatively urban and suburban places where there are like businesses around and saying, hey, why don't you get rid of this eyesore? The Arizona Republic, the paper there, called them out on it, and within a couple of years, they've already sold a lot of those. It's not a cheap thing. It requires getting, maps and all, and it's a lot of work. But at the same time, if you own all this stuff, you should try to see that it's managed the most effective way possible, whether or not you're doing it or a private entity is doing it. George is another example here. Wow, I didn't even press anything. But they basically went through all their stuff, and they saw a lot of opportunities to save money on leases and other things, and they did it. Oh wow, it went back. Okay. And yeah.
Are we stuck?
Yeah, there we go.
Well, yeah, and then once you have identified those things that you own as a government entity, then you can start looking at, well, do we need to? Asking that question, do we need to own this? And in the public sector, and this happens in private enterprise too, but we tend to see this tendency in public management that this sort of dust bunny mentality, you accumulate, you rarely divest. And that's problematic because, as Austell mentioned, if you don't know what you own, it's really hard to be a good steward of that asset or those assets. And so looking at how to divest those that are, once you've identified them, looking at how to offload the ones that you don't need anymore is important. You can look at things to sell. You can look at things to consolidate, get more efficient with, like office space, that sort of thing. And lots of different benefits can come out of that. But divesting those things that you don't necessarily need is important. And this could be a lot of different things. You want to start? Yeah. So it could be a lot of different things. It could be municipal utilities. There's a lot of municipal utilities that don't need to be government owned. In fact, I don't know what that trend is like in Illinois, but you have big cities, Boulder, Austin, places like that, Colorado Springs, that have municipally owned and operated broadband, gas. Philly owns its own gas company. Lots of things there where you might look at it and go, why? Why does Philadelphia need to own a gas company? I don't know. Is there a lack of private players? No, there's not, because actually a private company offered them a couple $2 billion to buy their asset, and they were going to shore that. They were going to take the proceeds of that and shore up their underfunded pension plan. City council ended up killing that concept. But utilities would be one sort of natural one where you could see that there's absolutely private enterprise out there that provides things like telecom, broadband, that sort of thing. Parks would be another area where you might have friends groups and that sort of thing that could step in and take over a role for something like that. Golf courses, one of my favorites to sort of poke at, but I still have been doing this for 15 plus years. I've not found a compelling public rationale for maintaining taxpayer subsidized golf courses. As much fun as it might be to play, Jim back there, who likes to play public municipal golf courses. Zoos, parking assets, airport, and here I'm going to stop because we are in the jurisdiction that was a pioneer of parking privatization. That didn't maybe go as well as I think the folks who conceived of that had originally envisioned, which is usually the case when you're starting to talk about when you're talking about the first prime mover in a new space. So I want to just stop here for a minute because Chicago has a lot of experience with this stuff, and I would be remiss if we didn't dive into that for a minute. And we watched this stuff when it was happening. We wrote about it. I wrote a lot about the Skyway and the parking garages and the parking meters ultimately. And just to provide some context on that, because we're here, I think Chicago really did an interesting thing about a decade ago, which was they set off some examples for other jurisdictions nationally to say, we have things that we've been, taking for granted as public assets that don't necessarily need to be, and we're going to look for a different way to manage that. They started with the Skyway, the public sector toll road that they ended up doing a long-term 99-year concession on with global toll road operators who do this sort of thing for a living. Then that was followed by a parking garage deal in the Millennium Park underneath that, and then followed by what, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the parking meters privatization from a few years ago. And the thinking there was, here's a new asset class, basically. Here's an asset class that nobody had really thought of as an asset class, which was parking meters. Because it's kind of an abstract thing. It's public right-of-way, but they're meters. It's kind of brick and mortar, but kind of not. It's kind of a service, kind of an asset. It was in this sort of space, and there had been some examples overseas of places that had looked at ways to divest parking assets, and they also had their experience with the Skyway and the parking garages, and so they looked at, hey, here's an asset. Now, the rationale for that was, I think very clearly at the time it was to plug budget deficits, which is not the reason to do privatization. I think there are other reasons for it. But, at the end of the day, each one of those had, hiccups along the way. Garages probably least so, because most people, parking garages are something that is not inherently governmental. People know that. People see in any given jurisdiction that you have actually municipal parking garages sitting next to private parking garages in the same city. That happens all the time. That's not necessarily unusual. But the parking meters was. That was a, kind of a new area. And I think they did some of that well and some of it very poorly. And I think, when I look at what did they do well, I think it was being creative and looking at a new asset class. When you look at what could have gone better, number one, they generated over $1 billion by divesting the parking meters and basically used most of those proceeds to plug one-time budget holes, which is just imprudent from a fiscal management standpoint. You don't want to divest the proceeds from a long-lived asset and then go spend them, right? You want to have some nexus temporally between those things. So, I would, if it was me, and I was mayor at the time, I would have probably looked at trying to do something like shoring up underfunded pensions, right? Obviously, huge issue in Chicago, huge issue in this state. That would be, I would say, a justifiable use of such proceeds. Or infrastructure, put it into other infrastructure. Paying down debt would be another one. So going and using it to shore up budget holes, I realized they were in a fiscal mess, and so that's kind of, it is what it is. But that's not usually the reason. That's, you usually want to have a different application of the proceeds in a situation like that. Interestingly, in both cases of the Skyway and the parking meters, Chicago was the first to do something like that in the U.S., privatizing a toll road, privatizing parking meter systems. And interestingly, in Indiana, in both situations, they follow those up basically with improvements upon those what I would call prime mover deals. So the Skyway was followed by the Indiana toll road deal, very similar situation. At the time, the exact same concessionaire running both. So you had this sort of seamless operation of, basically the same interstate in two different states. And Indiana, I think took that model and improved upon it. They improved upon it by dedicating the proceeds, mostly I would say, by dedicating the proceeds of the Indiana toll road lease to infrastructure. And basically the vast majority of that money was that they received from the investors was put right back into the ground. It was put back into that facility, it was put back into roads statewide. That helped build political consensus, but that's where they looked and said, how would we do the Skyway better? And that was an improvement. Same thing on the parking meters. When you look later, Indianapolis was only a year or two later that they followed with basically the same kind of deal. But they looked at Chicago and said, okay, number one, they took all the money up front. We don't necessarily need to do that. We could think about a different way to do revenue sharing. So instead they do like a revenue share every year instead of just getting a big bucket of money up front. Just different, I mean, they're both legitimate. There's two different ways to do it. They looked at the complaints in Chicago about the public sort of involvement process and the speed at which, these transactions sort of move through the political process and said, nope, we're going to have a longer process. We're going to have a bunch of public meetings. We're going to have people come out. And literally people came out and said, we like this about this proposal, but we don't like this. And some of that stuff, I mean, you can't take everybody's input, but they, the things that the city leaders thought was legitimate, they actually incorporated that public input and built that stuff into the contract. And so, kind of incrementally improved upon that. So when I look at, Chicago today, I mean, I think you've got, and then the other thing I think that the parking meters gets unfairly knocked for was kind of some rollout hiccups, which are totally predictable. And this is another thing Indianapolis improved upon. In Chicago, they basically said, we're going to have this parking meter situation. The rates are going to change. The rates are going to go up. And it's all going to take effect before we improve the technology to upgrade over these coin-based meters. So basically, we're going to be taking more money into an antiquated meter design, and nobody thought up front that that might be an issue. Where if you're putting like 3-4 times as many quarters in for each stay, that the meters might clog, and you might have problems. And so, they had some rollout issues. Some of this was predictable, but they got a lot of bad press. But 2 or 3 weeks in, that stuff was pretty much worked out, but the press damage was totally done. Indianapolis looked at that and said, no, let's actually require the vendor to put in the new meters first, then price increases then go into effect. We're not going to have this problem anymore. And so Chicago, just long story short, privatization is often a process of incremental improvement, and it's oftentimes a process where something imperfect lands, and then people iterate upon it and then improve. So just to put a point on this one, I wanted to make sure that we covered that, and happy to take any more questions later on the, any of the Chicago asset deals. Speaking of which,
yes. And yes, the last principle, yes, is making the case to the public, which is important from the front end. The government workers, they should be the first basically to know about it before any of the general public do. If you try to hide it from them, then it's going to be worse. It'd be harder to deal with later than earlier. And also, if you spend time communicating, then you might be able to win some of them over that otherwise might not be for it. I mean, even in my year and a half working for Reason, I've already talked to people about privatization, a lot of critics, and there are times where I see eyes light up where they kind of like, oh man, this isn't that bad. And I'm sure Lynn, that's like every week for him, has for the last decade. But absolutely, a lot of people criticize privatization for it not being transparent, but it compared to the government procurement process and government services, say typically not, but it's important when you go down this road to make sure that you are. And also, you're not going to get everything you want to get. These are all groups of people that want what they want, and you want what you want, and compromise is probably going to be necessary. There's going to be some give and take. No big deal. But if it works out, you might be able to get more next time it goes out for rebid for the service or whatever. And then, yes, and again, clear, consistent communication throughout is critical and important. And just lastly, just go through a couple of myths of privatization. It's a partisan creature of the right. I'm probably preaching to the choir. I mean, you've seen a lot of privatization around here, going back to Daley and all, so you know that it's very popular amongst both parties to an extent. Former Indianapolis mayor, Mayor Daley, I mentioned as well. More privatized under Clinton than Reagan, which I think more under W, less under Obama, but it's been. And then the second one, I'm sorry, is loss of public control, which that's mentioned a lot, but I don't see how. If you have that problem, you haven't done it right. I guess would be the answer. Well, yeah, better stated, more articulately stated. Like if you have that problem, then there's a problem that you've done something that you have done something that you did. And when you have performance-based, well-constructed contracts, the government actually gains control, and the public actually gains control, and having better assurance that what they want done gets done, and recourse if it doesn't get done. Whereas if it's publicly managed, then it may get done, and if it doesn't get done, you may find a way to get done. But if you have a binding contract specifying all what has to be done, then you have a better chance of things going smoothly in the long run.
Yeah, I mean that's a critical point. In the public sector, traditional public sector context, how are you going to fire someone for not delivering, 3 inches of grass, in the city park or the grounds of the Capitol? No, nobody gets fired if the grass gets to 4 or 5 inches, and that's the standard that you've applied. That's just the way the civil service sort of works. The private sector, the biggest incentive you can have is losing your shirt on a contract, and losing a contract and having not only the financial problem of losing that contract, but also the reputational risk. Next time you go in front of a public body and you're like, hey, we're the vendor, you pick us, we're the ones who do a good job of this. And then the first thing they say is, well, what happened in jurisdiction X? Because we see the press reports and you had issues there, right? And so having the ability fundamentally to lose that contract is a huge motivator. And being able to hire and fire people at will is something that the public managers can find value in, because it can bring more accountability in terms of adhering to a specified target for service delivery.
And another myth that gets repeated pretty much anytime privatization is mentioned is, it's bad for public employees. Well, first off, what's the purpose of government? Is it to create a bunch of jobs for people or to provide services? I mean, obviously it's the latter. But even still, most of the time when these things happen, no one gets laid off. If anything, what you have is you'll have a few people forced to early retirement. You have a few people that stay on and they get transitioned to some other part of the government, and some of them stay on with a private provider. Typically, pay will be about the same, sometimes a little more, but benefits are usually less. It's defined contribution, not defined benefit plans, things like that. And then, move into a private sector entity, it's a different sort of hierarchy, and there are other opportunities of movement up. So there's, it's different, and granted the benefits aren't as generous, but there are other ways that we think both make up for it.
This one is important. The professional mobility, this is one where I didn't really get clued into this until I was talking to somebody who was like a former municipal trash worker who went to a private provider and was telling me afterwards that, I was worried about it. I thought it was going to be terrible. I really didn't want to do this, but I did it. And then, wow, a few years later, all of a sudden, I was no longer kind of stuck in this particular city. I, all of a sudden, was in a corporate entity that provided services to hundreds, municipalities across the country. All of a sudden, I could be the regional director in some other state. Previously, I was in this city's municipal waste department, and my, upward mobility was here, because I had the guy above me, he's not going to be retiring for years. It's going to be forever before I get up there, and that wasn't even that high up the ladder. Going to a private company, well, all of a sudden, everything opens up. I've got opportunities out there across the country. I've got more mobility, vertically, horizontally, if you will, geographically. So anyway, that's an important point that I think gets, nobody ever talks about it, but certainly when you hear the unions and the other side come back and talk about privatization, that's not what you never hear about this. You never hear this story. You hear the other side of the story and fears about what's going to happen.
And then contracting always saves money. Oftentimes it can, but it just kind of depends on what you're looking for too. If you're not looking to save, to cut costs necessarily, you may just be looking for service improvements that may end up costing more, but the service provided is greater, then it evens itself out. And another thing is when you do services bid out for competition, the amount of people that respond is important. More competitors to some extent can drive them all and drive costs down some. If they're not a lot, then you may not have as much of that. But as I mentioned before, quality goes way beyond costs, and while harder to find, there's still a lot of metrics you can do to make sure to see that happens and contract based on that as opposed to just pure costs.
All right. So that's it. What questions do you have?
Okay, if you want to move over there. Since we have two cameras, that one doesn't move and this one does. If you guys stand together, it makes it a lot easier. And I'll stand here with my Gene Rayburn microphone. Match game reference, anyone? Remember? Got you right there. Excellent. So now is Q&A time. Please put your hand up if you have a question. And Chris in the back will come over with the microphone. If you could identify yourself so that our speakers know to whom they are speaking, that would be just great. And those of you online, I'm watching the chat room in both the YouTube page and Facebook, and I will read them if I get a good one. We'll start right here.
Hi, Diane Bast with Heartland. You guys have been doing this, Reason has been doing this for a really long time. Is there anything that has happened recently in privatization that maybe Bob Poole would never have imagined could be privatized? Anything like really new and exciting and off the wall?
Well, thank you, Diane. The question was basically what's new and exciting out there. I think if I had to look back over the last 5 years, I'll give you an answer and maybe also have a different one. For me, I think it's probably social impact bonds, and what that is, it's got a weird name. It's not actually a bond, it's just a contract, but effectively, Oslo described it earlier, and if it's a situation in which private investors, we talked about putting private money into infrastructure. That's kind of easy, and there's revenue streams, that kind of flow in a toll road or that kind of situation, which, that is a kind of discrete business enterprise. The newest cutting edge is bringing private dollars and private financing to social services. And that's what I'm talking about. So it's basically saying, let's take that same, kind of construct, but apply it over here. And I'll give you an example to make it more concrete. So New York City was one of the first that did this in the US. And they looked at they wanted to improve youth recidivism at the Rikers Island facility in New York City. And so they had Bloomberg Philanthropies and other folks that got involved in this. And effectively, private dollars were put up by Goldman, I can't remember who else, I think a consortium. But basically, there was private money put in to basically fund nonprofits who were basically competing over who can do the best job at improving the recidivism among, or lowering the recidivism rate for the youth of 14 to 17, aged 14 to 17 in that facility. And so the idea was, if the nonprofits apply this intervention and it works, then New York City would then basically pay back the money to the investors with basically bands of profit, if you will. So if you exceed, if you really do a great job of reducing recidivism, you actually have a profit. Now it's up to there was capped. It wasn't unlimited. But the idea was, let's put private dollars into social services. Governments are going to put money into testing untested ideas, right? So the idea was, let's take people who are doing a good job out in the nonprofit world, throw them into this, and try to get better results than government's doing. And if it works, the investors get repaid. If it doesn't, they lose. And that's the concept. And that's being applied in basically, I think at this point, probably hundreds of these around the world, a bunch in the US. I think Illinois might be one. I'd have to go and look if the state's doing something in this regard. But I think it's sort of taking this sort of private financing tool and applying it to this arena of social services where there is no, revenue stream outside of government dollars. So anyway, that's what I would answer. I don't know if you have a different one.
Yeah, and I've only been in the game a few years, so I guess maybe I'm really easily surprised at this point. But some of the stuff I've seen with universities, some of their agreement, it used to just be we need to build a new dorm, or we need to, and that would be a P3 agreement for higher ed, basically. But now you have Ohio State. They entered in a 50-year lease of all their power and and water infrastructure, with all these built-in incentives, by X year, 25% of the energy has to be from these sources. They have to improve efficiency by 25% along the way. And so the scope and the size of some of these things, and just after researching some with the university P3s, and it's usually just building stuff. It's that. And just have it turn in this whole new direction. UC Merced, a new school in the UCal system, is another example. They're a new school, and it's like, yeah, our student population is going to quadruple in the next few years, and we need someone who can build stuff and repurpose all this land, and and it's just a very comprehensive 50-year agreement on just all sorts of development sort of things other than just building dorms. But
Building a campus from
yeah,
scratch.
building a campus basically,
is what that was.
roads and everything.
Yeah, I should say Ohio State also is one of the folks that also followed Chicago in the parking meter thing. So it's Chicago, then Indy, then Ohio State University. And they looked at both Chicago and Indianapolis and said, what did they do wrong? Let's improve upon it. So, I mean, there's sort of natural iterations here. Did that answer your question? Good.
Thanks.
Sure, thank you.
We have a question right here, and then we'll come over here to Mike.
Thank you for an extensive analysis. You've covered almost all the points. I'm going to give you the ones that are missing.
Okay.
One is the basic work by Bill Niskanen, who did a work on bureaucracy and representative government. And he built his theory on Milton Friedman's idea of an all-or-nothing demand curve. And that is, government presents services on an all-or-nothing basis, and so it overproduces those services. The other thing that's missing is Joe Schweiderman, a local guy who did an important work for Heartland years ago when we first got started, where he observed that, as you have observed, that government is involved in dealing with peak demand, and that there are extra costs for handling that peak demand. His subject was subscription buses. There was a threat that there would be a strike and the public transportation system would be shut down. And some black ladies on the south side recruited school buses to drive them from their houses, from their home dwellings in the south side to their places of work in the loop, and it was called subscription buses. And Joe Schweiderman's contribution was subscription buses handling the peak load problem. If you allow them to do that, it improves the finances of the basic government service that's being offered. And that's an important point, and Joe was able to fend off, and Heartland was able to fend off all the people that were going to make the subscription buses illegal. The other thing is that there are a lot of spontaneous privatization things that come up. My work, if you can't make a comment about missing citations without citing your own work. So my work on utility regulation observes that the effect of regulation is to build in extra capacity to handle peak load problems, especially when one of the utility suppliers goes down for whatever reason. And now the private sector has come up with small generators that are fill in for that very important point. There's a big sale or purchase of snow shovels in the East Coast now. Apparently no one had the foresight to stock in extra snow shovels, but some people used other shovels and went into business shoveling walks in exchange for being paid by the local. In Santa Barbara, where they've had 3 disasters in a row, the largest wildfire in the history of California, followed by air pollution problems with the ash and the air pollution, and spontaneously came up with Amtrak deciding that they would connect Ventura with Santa Barbara with putting extra cars on the trains for just that short section, while Highway 101 was out of commission because it was full of boulders and muds. Also, yachts and ferry boats that would carry tourists around went into the ferry business to connect Santa Barbara with Ventura. All of this spontaneously, and it's copying what you see every day on the grocery store. Grocery stores don't wait for people to walk in the door and say they want a loaf of bread and then run out and try and find a loaf of bread for them. They stock in advance, and you can see that as possibly a waste, but clearly it's borrowing on the old idea from Joseph and the Pharaoh in the book of Genesis, and that is, if you are preparing for disaster, you stock up ahead. And I've written an article on that as well, and it's very interesting. But one of the implications from the Joseph and the Pharaoh study is that there's a discount rate, and it is 18%. That's a divinely inspired, no inflation interest rate that you can use to guide your decisions on preparing for an emergency. So that's what I thought was missing. But the point about peak load demand is that it's not the case always that government spends a lot of money for accommodating peak load demand. There's a whole class of cases where they don't spend enough, or they're incapable of spending enough, and there's potential for privatization.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. And one of the comments that you made me think of something new we're starting to see in the privatization world, which is, you were talking about peak demand, and in the transit arena, we're starting to see Uber get involved, where transit agencies are now contracting with Uber to basically provide some last mile type services, because now, like, Uber is a great example of something where you can handle peak demand, in a kind of transportation kind of environment. That 10 years ago, nobody would have known what we were talking about. Today, technology has transformed and created this new pathway for new opportunities in privatization. So, I don't know, that's just something that you had a lot of useful insights there. That was one that, just to build upon kind of a newer emerging theme in that peak demand arena. But thank you for adding to the discourse tonight.
We have time for a couple more questions. One right over here.
Yeah, so I was looking at your presentation, and you had a slide about a privatization of non-core assets.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you mentioned were golf courses. And so in the city of Chicago, there's 5 municipal golf courses. I've golfed all of them, just for clarification. But anyway, decades ago, when the Chicago Park District used to run those courses, they were in really bad shape. The management was privatized,
Mm-hmm.
probably under Mayor Daley, and this company that runs it, they did a really good job with it while maintaining low costs for people to use. So that was probably one of the more successful privatization efforts that few people know about.
Sure.
With that, just a spin-off of that is that with the Obama Presidential Library coming up, that library, they want to take 2 of the municipal golf courses, make it part of the library, the Presidential Library complex. And by doing so, they'd raise the fees a lot, which would prevent a lot of people in the area from using the course. And that's who the intended recipients are. So there's a controversy over that's going on. Just probably, as far as the parking meter deal, that was just a fiasco, general fiasco. Before the city privatized it, they made about $20 million a year with the parking meters. And the parking meters did its job. They regulated the flow of traffic and high demand parking spaces. With the privatization, essentially what that did is that it chases money out of the city. So the money that Chicago Parking Meters LLC makes from it, all that money, it flows to the corporate headquarters, Morgan Stanley, New York City. It goes to its investors around the world, to include the United Arab Emirates. They were one of the original stakeholders in the parking meter deal. I believe they still are. And so the parking meter deal, it's a 75-year deal, but and we're probably stuck with it until 2084. And so with that, we've seen in Chicago, we've seen some good privatization measures, but we've seen some that just didn't pan out well. And again, like you had mentioned with the Chicago deal, the big factor was that there wasn't any transparency with it. It was just rushed through in less than a week. On a Monday in December, the public found out about it through a leak, and by Thursday, the full city council had voted on it, and there was just no time for input and such. And so that's one of the reasons why you had all these issues. And when Indianapolis did their deal, there was a little bit more input. And so the transparency thing, you have to have public input.
Yeah, in fact, thank you, first of all, thank you for the comments and the observations. I think my recollection is that a couple years ago, under the current mayor, Chicago passed some sort of privatization transparency ordinance to basically put in a review period before similar transactions in the future, like well, I don't think Midway's on the table anymore, but Midway was an airport, that they were looking at doing a P3 type of situation. There are other assets too, and having that kind of process in place, I think is, I think it's important to put trust back in the system after. Look, and some of the things you mentioned, I disagree with. I mean, I don't care if the United Arab Emirates has some profit stream coming off it. I don't care. We have Coca-Cola selling Coke in practically every country in the world. I don't have a problem with that either. So, like some of those I don't really care about. I don't think they're real concerns that bother me. Just looking at how global companies operate. Other parts of that, I think, for instance, I think the parking meter, you can talk about revenues coming before and after, but the bottom line is the city did a terrible job of maintaining that parking meter system. And if you look at the metrics before and after, I realize, this is the geeky level of detail, but that's what we're here for. I mean, we're here to try to think at this geeky level of how do you get this right? You look at the revenue streams there and things like that. I mean, I'd say, first of all, the city didn't give up all the revenue streams from parking. It was the parking dollars, but fines and all that still stay with the city, which is a huge piece of the revenue. So people who claim that the city just gave up all the revenue, that's not true. Two, I think that deal one of the things I think was unfairly smeared, and this is still a bogus thing I still see 10 years later, is this notion that the city got ripped off. And where that came from was a city inspector general report that basically applied a bogus discount rate for pricing out the future revenue streams of that asset and treated it as if it was as safe as like a water system or something like that. And if you do that, you're going to get numbers back that would suggest that you left money on the table. But if you actually applied like a discount rate that would be like, I think appropriately, that would reflect an appropriate amount of risk for that asset class, parking meters. There are a lot of things over the next 75 years that could throw that kind of deal off completely. Technology, technology first and foremost, gas prices, you start going down the list, urban development trends, all sorts of things could throw off what that revenue stream would have looked like under the city's hands or what it looks like in the private sector's hands. So, anyway, I think if you apply the right discounting to that deal, which I don't believe that inspector general did, then you basically get what everybody who was involved in that said, which is, yeah, this was the best deal by far off of the real prices that were discovered through a market discovery process. So anyway, not to rant about the parking meter stuff too much, but I think it's important. That's not to say that it was perfect. I've already sort of alluded to that. There are a lot of things that they could have done better. Certainly the transparency piece, but there's also parts of it that I think were, overblown, I guess. And at the end of the day, it was imperfect. And at the end of the day, just like other things, you can either abandon at that step and say, no, we're just done, or you can try to get things done and improve upon it. And that's what, I would rather see I don't believe it was a failure, but some do, and that's fine. I get that. I would rather see that, but have a failure spawn success, then not. That's how innovation works in a capitalist society. So anyway, imperfect stuff happens. I get it. It's not pretty. It's not good. It's not, enjoyable, but it is what it is.
We have time only for one more question. We're going to go right here. Carl, you have to
Sure.
say it in 15 seconds.
Okay, when I was in Washington D.C. area, I was manufacturing optics. I had a competitor, what was then called the National Bureau of Standards. My price was $50, theirs was $100. They got the contract. But in the Soviet Union, I've lived extensively, and I could see the issues there were the same as in United States. And basically, even food needed to be privatized, and there was a free market compared to the government. And I never saw an ear of corn in a grocery store that was government-owned. Just some comments there.
Thank you.
Sorry, I took more than 15.
Since they're not going to answer because they can't, because it's such a great statement, you're absolved.
Mike.
Let's have a round of applause for our two speakers
Thank you.
for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Just one announcement. The Heartland Institute is having a pre-Super Bowl party on, yes, I know. I'm a Steelers fan, so I'm going to try to muddle through wearing my Steeler outfit. But it's January 25th from 5:30 to 7:30. Since we didn't have a holiday party this year, we thought, what's the biggest secular holiday in America? That's the Super Bowl. And we wanted to do it before February, so it's going to be January 25th. So you're all invited. It's free. Come on over. Bring some friends. It's here just to have some good time. Watch some clips of the Bears when they used to be good. We'll have a great time. So thank you all for being here. We hope to see you on the 25th and then all through this year for events at Heartland Institute. Thank you and good night.
I think I still have a